Be Ted Wagner. Ted Wagner, the father of your country. The father of your country, Ted Wagner.
Let's be honest and fair. American history has some inconvenient truths. And perhaps the greatest of them all is that the man who penned these words, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He penned those words, but he was also a slaveholder. But that's another talk for another time. I'd like to talk about George Washington, the acknowledged father of our country, who was also a slaveholder. Recently, the president of the San Francisco School Board tweeted something. He said it's time to consider renaming schools that bear the name of slave owners, including Washington. We should rename Washington High School, he tweeted. No schools named after slave owners. He also expressed the hope that they would switch the name of the schools to LGBT figures. San Francisco. Is this unlikely to happen? Maybe not. In the 1990s, the Orleans Parish School Board erased the names of George Washington and other slaveholders from their schools. George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis all had their names removed. Let's reflect for a moment. George Washington was a man of his times. He was born in 1732 to the landed gentry of colonial Virginia. He was raised among an aristocracy that condoned slavery. At 11 years old, he inherited 10 slaves from his father. When he was 30, he inherited more from his half-brother Lawrence. As a young adult, Washington purchased at least 8 more slaves. When Martha, Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died without a will, she received a life interest in 1/3 of his estate, including 80 slaves. It's also true that the Fugitive Slave Act was signed into law by President George Washington on February 12, 1793. I told this recently to a friend who admires Washington. His response was, "That's your opinion." It happens to be true, and an inconvenient truth. Let's not whitewash history. It's also true that when Washington was president, the capital was in Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania had a law at that time that you could bring slaves into the state for 6 months, but after 6 months they were freed under the law. So George Washington brought his slaves in, and before the 6 months was up, sent them back to Virginia and reset the clock. It's fair to say that George Washington's views on slavery evolved over time. It's also fair to say that those that want to rename schools leave out some important facts. During this period in Virginia prior to 1782, a slave owner was only allowed to free for meritorious service and only with the approval of the governor and his council. They could just not free slaves willy-nilly. Neither George or Martha Washington could free the dower slaves she inherited by law. And upon Martha's death, these individuals reverted to the Custis estate and were divided among her grandchildren. At the time of George Washington's death, there was 317 slaves at Mount Vernon. 153 of those slaves were dower slaves, which he could not free. Also left out is that Washington took great pains to free all of his slaves that he could. And he was the only founding father slave owner to do so. George Washington was a great, if complex, man. His reputation for courage, integrity, and good judgment inspired confidence. The men of the Revolutionary Army loved him. He kept together a starving, poorly undersupplied Revolutionary Army through many defeats until victories at Trenton, Yorktown, convinced the British that they could never extinguish fires of independence and liberty. Let me wind up with William Billy Lee, who most likely none of you have ever heard of. He was Washington's valet or manservant. Lee served at Washington's side throughout the 8 years of the Revolutionary War, including the bitter winter at Valley Forge and at the siege of Yorktown. When the retired president died, William Lee was the only slave freed immediately in his will. Washington provided Lee with an annual pension of $30 a month. It's equivalent to $550 now. And he noted, "This I give him as a testimony of my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful services during the Revolutionary War." According to historians, Lee rode alongside Washington in the thick of the battle, ready to hand over to the general a spare horse or his telescope or whatever else he might be needed. If Billy Lee had been a white man, he would have had an honored place in American history because of his close proximity to George Washington during the most exciting periods of his career. But because he was a black servant, a humble slave, he has been virtually ignored by both black and white historians and biographers. There are no monuments or schools named after William Lee. He is mostly lost in the mist of time. Rather than tear down the memory of a good-hearted man like George Washington, would it not be more American to name a new school after William Lee? Quite a good audience for comments.
Thank you. We'll now have 1 minute of silence to allow folks to complete their judge's ballot.